I discovered my wife had a secret apartment with another man. She claimed it was just for meditation and yoga, that he was her spiritual guide. So, I hired a private investigator and exposed her elaborate double life. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but here I am at 2 a.m., unable to sleep after discovering that my wife of 12 years has been living a complete double life. My name is Robert. I'm 38 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I had a pretty solid marriage with my wife, Isabella. We've been together since college, got married right after graduation, and have 2 beautiful kids, Lucas, who's 9, and Sophie, who's 6. Isabella works as a freelance graphic designer, which means she has a flexible schedule and often works from home. I'm an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, so I have pretty regular hours, usually out of the house by 8 o'clock in the morning and home by 6 o'clock in the evening. We live in a nice suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes outside the city, and up until recently, I thought we had this perfect little life together. Isabella has always been into health and wellness. She's done yoga for as long as I've known her. She's constantly trying new diets and cleanses, and she's always reading books about mindfulness and spiritual growth. I've never been particularly interested in any of that myself, but I've always been supportive of her interests. She'd go to yoga classes a few times a week, attend weekend wellness retreats occasionally, and I just figured it was her way of staying healthy and managing stress. About 6 months ago, Isabella started getting really serious about her spiritual practice. She began meditating for an hour every morning before the kids woke up. She started eating a very specific vegan diet, and she began talking about this amazing new spiritual teacher she'd found named Kiran. According to Isabella, Kiran was this enlightened guru who had studied in India and Tibet, and he was helping her reach new levels of consciousness and inner peace. At first, I was happy that she'd found something that seemed to bring her so much joy. She was definitely more energetic and positive, and she kept talking about how much clarity and purpose she was gaining from Kiran's teachings. She started going to these special meditation sessions with him twice a week, usually in the evenings after dinner when I was home to watch the kids. But then things started getting weird. Isabella began staying out later and later for these meditation sessions. She'd leave at 7 o'clock in the evening and not come home until after midnight, claiming that Kiran had been taking her and his other students through these intensive spiritual experiences that couldn't be rushed. When I asked her where these sessions were taking place, she was always vague about the location, just saying it was at Kiran's sanctuary somewhere downtown. She also started being really secretive about her phone and computer. Isabella had never been particularly private about her devices before. We knew each other's passwords and would often use each other's phones if one of ours was dead or charging. But suddenly, she was taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, and she'd quickly close her laptop if I walked into the room while she was working. The changes in her behavior were gradual enough that I initially chalked them up to her new spiritual practice. Maybe she was just becoming more mindful about technology use, or maybe she was dealing with some personal stuff that she needed to process privately. I tried talking to her about it a few times, asking if everything was okay and if there was anything she wanted to discuss, but she'd just say that she was going through a period of spiritual growth and needed some space to focus on her inner journey. Things really started bothering me about 2 months ago when Isabella began talking about needing a quiet space for her meditation practice. She said that meditating at home was becoming difficult because of distractions from the kids and household noise, and she wanted to find a dedicated space where she could really focus on her spiritual work. She mentioned that Kiran had suggested she might benefit from having her own private meditation room somewhere peaceful where she could go to center herself whenever she needed to. I suggested that we could convert the spare bedroom upstairs into a meditation space for her, but Isabella said that wouldn't work because she needed complete separation from the family environment to really connect with her spiritual practice. She said that Kiran had recommended finding a small apartment or studio space that could serve as her personal retreat. This seemed like a pretty extreme and expensive solution to me, especially since we were already paying a mortgage and trying to save money for the kids' college funds. But Isabella was so passionate about it, and she promised that she'd cover the cost with her freelance income. So, I reluctantly agreed to let her look for something small and affordable. Within a week, Isabella had found what she described as the perfect space, a small studio apartment downtown that she said was ideal for meditation and yoga practice. She was so excited about it that she signed the lease immediately and started spending most of her free time there, setting it up with meditation cushions, yoga mats, and what she called spiritual artwork. At first, Isabella would invite me to come see the space. But every time I suggested visiting, she'd say that it wasn't ready yet, or that Kiran had advised her to keep it as a completely personal sanctuary for the first few months while she established her practice there. She said that having other people's energy in the space too early might interfere with the spiritual atmosphere she was trying to create. I found this reasoning pretty strange, but Isabella seemed so happy and fulfilled with her new spiritual journey that I didn't want to be the unsupportive husband who questioned her personal growth. She was definitely more confident and radiant than she'd been in years, and our relationship in many ways seemed to be improving. She was more affectionate with me and more patient with the kids, and she kept talking about how much peace and clarity she was gaining from her practice. But there were also things that didn't quite add up. Isabella was supposedly spending 4 or 5 hours at a time at this meditation studio, which seemed like an awfully long time to just sit quietly and meditate. When I asked her what she was doing there for so many hours, she'd talk about these complex spiritual practices that Kieran was teaching her, involving breathing exercises, movement meditations, and energy work that apparently took a very long time to complete properly. She also started mentioning Kieran constantly in conversation. Everything was Kieran says this, or Kieran taught me that, or Kieran thinks I should try this new approach. It was like she'd become completely devoted to this guy's teachings. And while I understood that spiritual teachers could be influential, the level of her attachment seemed excessive. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago on a Saturday afternoon. Isabella had told me she was going to her meditation studio for a few hours to work on some intensive spiritual practice that Kieran had recommended. The kids were at my parents' house for the weekend, so I decided to surprise Isabella by bringing her some of her favorite tea and maybe taking her out to lunch afterward. I'd never actually been to the studio before, but I knew it was in the downtown area, and Isabella had mentioned that it was near the Arts District. I figured I could call her when I got downtown, and she could give me the exact address. But when I called Isabella's phone, it went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times over the next hour, thinking maybe she was in deep meditation and had her phone turned off, but I kept getting voicemail. Finally, I decided to just drive around the Arts District and see if I could spot her car, thinking maybe I could find the building and wait for her to finish her session. I was driving slowly through the residential streets near the Arts District when I spotted Isabella's car parked in front of a nice brownstone building. I was excited to finally see where she'd been spending so much time. So, I parked behind her car and walked up to the building to see if I could figure out which unit was hers. The building had about 8 apartments, and there was a directory by the front door. I was looking through the names, trying to figure out which apartment Isabella was renting, when I heard familiar laughter coming from one of the second-floor windows that was open. It was definitely Isabella's laugh, but she was laughing in a way that I hadn't heard in years, this light, carefree, almost flirtatious giggle that she used to do when we were first dating. I looked up at the window and could see shadows moving around inside. And I could hear Isabella's voice talking to someone, though I couldn't make out the words. I stood there for a moment, confused about why Isabella would be having what sounded like a social conversation when she was supposed to be meditating alone. Then I heard a man's voice responding to her, and they both started laughing again. My heart started racing because this definitely didn't sound like a meditation session or a spiritual practice. It sounded like Isabella was having a casual, intimate conversation with some guy in what was supposed to be her private meditation space. I tried calling her phone again, and I could actually hear it ringing inside the apartment. But instead of answering, I heard Isabella say something to the man about how she needed to turn her phone off because she was supposed to be unreachable during her spiritual practice time. That's when I knew for certain that something was very wrong. I walked back to my car and sat there for about an hour, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to go up to the apartment and confront Isabella directly, but another part of me was hoping there was some innocent explanation for what I'd heard. Maybe Kieran really was just her spiritual teacher, and they were having some kind of counseling session that involved talking and laughing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what was happening. The tone of their voices, the intimate laughter, the fact that Isabella had lied to me about what she was doing there, it all pointed to something that had nothing to do with meditation or spiritual practice. I finally drove home and spent the rest of the day trying to act normal. When Isabella got home that evening, she came back around 6 o'clock, glowing and happy, talking about what an amazing spiritual breakthrough she'd had during her practice session. She went on and on about the profound insights Kieran had shared with her and how much progress she was making on her spiritual journey. Listening to her lie so easily and enthusiastically made me feel sick to my stomach. This was my wife of 12 years, the mother of my children, and she was sitting there spinning this elaborate fantasy about meditation and spiritual growth when I knew she'd spent the afternoon laughing and talking with some guy in a secret apartment. Update 1. The next few days were torture. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd witnessed, but I also couldn't figure out how to confront Isabella without admitting that I'd basically stalked her to her secret apartment. I kept going back and forth between feeling angry and feeling like maybe I was overreacting to what could have been an innocent situation. I tried to pay more attention to Isabella's behavior to see if I could pick up on any other signs that something was going on. She continued with her regular schedule of going to the meditation studio 3 or 4 times a week, always for several hours at a time. She'd come home from these sessions in an incredibly good mood, talking about her spiritual progress and how much peace she was finding through her practice. But I also started noticing things that I'd previously overlooked. Isabella had been dressing differently lately, not drastically, but she'd been putting more effort into her appearance on the days when she was going to her meditation sessions. She'd wear her nicest yoga clothes, spend extra time on her hair and makeup, and even put on jewelry, which seemed weird for someone who was supposedly just going to sit alone and meditate. She'd also been getting packages delivered to the house that she'd quickly take upstairs without mentioning what they were. When I asked about them, she'd say they were just supplies for her spiritual practice, special oils, crystals, books, things like that. But some of the packages were clearly from clothing stores, which didn't make sense if she was just buying meditation supplies. The worst part was how guilty I felt for being suspicious of my own wife. Isabella seemed happier than she'd been in years, and our relationship had actually improved in many ways since she'd started her spiritual practice. She was more affectionate with me, more present with the kids, and more positive about life in general. Part of me wondered if I was just being paranoid and jealous because she'd found something fulfilling that didn't involve me. But I couldn't shake the memory of hearing her laughing with that man in the apartment, or the way she'd so casually lied about needing to turn off her phone during her spiritual practice. Those weren't the actions of someone who was just taking meditation classes. After about a week of driving myself crazy with speculation, I decided I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. I couldn't keep living with this uncertainty and suspicion, and I couldn't confront Isabella without more information about what was actually happening in that apartment. So, I hired a private investigator. I'd never thought I'd be the kind of person who would spy on his wife, but I felt like I was left with no choice. I found a reputable investigation firm through online research, and I met with a detective named Patricia who specialized in marital investigations. I explained the situation to her, the secret apartment, the suspicious behavior, the elaborate stories about spiritual practice, and she said it was definitely worth looking into. Patricia assured me that what I was asking for was completely legal and ethical. Isabella was my wife, and I had a right to know if she was being dishonest about where she was spending her time and how she was spending our money. The apartment lease was probably in Isabella's name, but since we were married, I had a legitimate interest in knowing what was happening there. Patricia's plan was to conduct surveillance of the apartment building during the times when Isabella was supposedly there for her meditation sessions. She'd document who was coming and going, take photographs of any interactions, and try to identify the man I'd heard talking with Isabella. I felt terrible about spying on my wife, but I also felt like I needed to protect myself and my family. If Isabella was having an affair, I needed to know about it so I could make informed decisions about our marriage and our future. And if she really was just taking meditation classes, then the investigation would prove that, and I could apologize for doubting her. Patricia began her surveillance the following week during one of Isabella's regular Tuesday evening sessions. She positioned herself across the street from the brownstone building and documented everything that happened. What she discovered was even worse than I'd feared. Isabella arrived at the building around 7 p.m., just like she told me she would, but instead of going to a meditation class, she used her own key to enter the building and went directly to apartment 2B. About 10 minutes later, a man arrived who also had his own key to the same apartment. Patricia was able to take clear photographs of this man, and it was obvious from their body language when he arrived that Isabella and this guy knew each other very well. They embraced and kissed when he came in, and through the open windows, Patricia could hear them talking and laughing in an intimate, familiar way. The man appeared to be in his early 40s with long dark hair and a beard, wearing expensive-looking clothes that had a kind of bohemian, artistic style. He was handsome in a rugged, unconventional way, and he definitely looked like someone who might present himself as a spiritual teacher or guru. Patricia conducted surveillance on 3 different occasions over the course of 2 weeks, and the pattern was always the same. Isabella would arrive at the apartment first, the man would show up shortly afterward, and they'd spend 3 to 4 hours together before leaving separately. They clearly had a routine established, and they were obviously very comfortable with each other. Patricia was also able to do some research on the apartment lease and discovered that it was indeed rented in Isabella's name, but the man, whose name turned out to be Connor Murphy, was listed as an additional occupant. So, this wasn't just a space that Isabella was renting for meditation, it was essentially a shared apartment that she was maintaining with another man. When Patricia presented me with her report, including photographs and documentation of the apartment lease, I felt like my entire world had collapsed. There was no ambiguity about what was happening. My wife was having an affair, and she'd been lying to me for months about it. But what made it even worse was the elaborate nature of the deception. This wasn't just a simple affair where Isabella had fallen for someone and made a mistake. She'd created this entire fictional story about spiritual practice and meditation. She'd manipulated me into agreeing to pay for a secret apartment, and she'd been living a double life for months while acting like the perfect wife and mother at home. The level of planning and deception required to pull this off was staggering. Isabella had researched spiritual practices enough to talk convincingly about meditation and yoga. She'd created a believable character in Kiran, the spiritual teacher, who I now realized was probably just Connor using a fake name. She'd maintained this elaborate charade for months, lying to me on a daily basis while acting like she loved me and was committed to our marriage. Update 2. Armed with Patricia's evidence, I knew I had to confront Isabella, but I wanted to be strategic about how I did it. I was angry and hurt, but I also wanted to make sure I handled the situation in a way that would protect my interests and my children's interests in whatever came next. First, I consulted with a divorce attorney to understand my rights and options. The lawyer reviewed Patricia's report and advised me that Isabella's affair and deception would definitely work in my favor if we ended up going through a divorce. The fact that she'd been using marital funds to maintain a secret apartment with another man was particularly damaging to any claims she might make about deserving a larger share of our assets. The attorney also advised me to start documenting our financial situation and securing important documents before confronting Isabella. If she realized that I knew about the affair, she might try to hide assets or take other actions that could complicate a potential divorce. So, I spent about a week quietly gathering financial records, copying important documents, and making sure I had a clear picture of our assets and debts. I also started keeping a detailed log of Isabella's comings and goings, noting every time she claimed to be going to meditation but was actually going to the secret apartment. During this week, Isabella continued her normal routine, acting like the loving wife and mother while secretly maintaining her relationship with Connor. She'd come home from her meditation sessions glowing and happy, talking about her spiritual progress and how much inner peace she was finding through her practice. Watching her lie so effortlessly was absolutely heartbreaking. This was a woman I'd trusted completely, someone I'd built a life with and had children with, and she was capable of maintaining this level of deception without showing any signs of guilt or remorse. Finally, I decided it was time to confront her. I planned to do it on a Saturday morning when the kids were at their weekly swimming lessons, so we'd have privacy, and I wouldn't have to worry about them overhearing a potentially explosive conversation. That Saturday morning, I made the kids breakfast and drove them to their swimming lessons like normal. When I got back home, Isabella was in the kitchen reading one of her spiritual books and drinking her morning tea. She looked up and smiled when I walked in, asking how the kids were doing and whether they were excited about their lessons. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table and said we needed to have a serious conversation. Isabella immediately looked concerned and asked if everything was okay, if there was something wrong with work or the kids or my family. I told her that I knew about Connor and the apartment. The change in Isabella's expression was immediate and dramatic. All the color drained from her face, and she looked like someone who'd just been caught in a terrible lie, which of course she had been. She started to say something, then stopped, then started again, clearly trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, she asked how I knew, and I told her about hiring the private investigator and seeing the surveillance reports. I showed her some of Patricia's photographs, including pictures of her and Connor embracing outside the apartment building. Isabella stared at the photographs for a long time without saying anything. Then she started crying and said that I didn't understand the situation, that it wasn't what it looked like, and that she could explain everything. I told her I was listening. Isabella's explanation was even more ridiculous than I'd expected. She admitted that Connor was real and that she'd been spending time with him at the apartment, but she insisted that their relationship was purely spiritual. According to her story, Connor really was a spiritual teacher and healer, and he'd been helping her work through deep emotional and spiritual issues that she'd been carrying for years. She said that Connor had identified some serious spiritual blockages in her energy and that he'd been using advanced healing techniques to help her release these blockages and find her true self. She claimed that some of these healing sessions involved physical contact and emotional release work that might look intimate to an outside observer, but that it was all part of the spiritual healing process. Isabella also said that she'd lied about the nature of their sessions because she knew I wouldn't understand or support her need for this kind of deep spiritual work. She said that Connor had warned her that people who weren't spiritually evolved might misinterpret the healing work they were doing, and that she'd created the story about meditation classes to avoid having to explain something that I wouldn't be able to comprehend. When I asked about the apartment and why she needed a shared space with Connor for this spiritual work, Isabella said that Connor's healing practice required a specially prepared environment with specific energy and spiritual protections. She said that the apartment had been blessed and cleansed according to ancient spiritual traditions and that Connor needed regular access to the space to maintain its spiritual integrity. She also claimed that she and Connor had never been physically intimate in a romantic way, and that any physical contact between them was purely for healing purposes. She said that Connor had studied sacred sexuality and tantric healing practices in India and that some of his techniques involved working with sexual energy to promote spiritual growth, but that it wasn't sexual in the way that I was thinking. I just sat there listening to this elaborate explanation, amazed by how creative Isabella could be when she was backed into a corner. She was essentially asking me to believe that she'd been spending months in a secret apartment with another man, lying about it constantly, and that it was all just spiritual healing that involved working with sexual energy, but somehow wasn't actually sexual. When she finished her explanation, I asked her if she really expected me to believe that story. Isabella got defensive and said that this was exactly why she hadn't told me the truth from the beginning, because she knew I was too closed-minded and spiritually immature to understand the work she was doing with Connor. She said that Connor had helped her become a better person, a better wife, and a better mother, and that I should be grateful for the positive changes in her life instead of being suspicious and controlling. She accused me of violating her privacy by hiring a private investigator, and said that my actions showed that I didn't trust her or respect her spiritual journey. This was the moment when I realized that Isabella was so deep in her delusion that she actually believed her own lies. She'd convinced herself that her affair was some kind of spiritual practice, and she was angry at me for not supporting her growth. I told Isabella that I didn't believe a word of her explanation and that I wanted her to choose between Connor and our marriage. I said that if she ended the relationship immediately and agreed to marriage counseling, we might be able to work through this, but that I wasn't going to continue being married to someone who was maintaining a secret relationship with another man, regardless of what she called it. Isabella said that I was being unreasonable and that I was trying to control her spiritual development. She said that her relationship with Connor was helping her become her authentic self and that she couldn't just abandon that growth to appease my insecurities. When I pressed her to make a choice, Isabella said that she needed time to think about it and to discuss the situation with Connor to get his guidance on how to handle my ultimatum. The fact that she wanted to consult with Connor about our marriage was the final straw for me. I told Isabella that if she needed to talk to another man about whether she wanted to stay married to me, then she'd already made her choice. Update 3. That same day, I packed a bag for myself and another bag for the kids. And I drove to my brother's house to stay for a few days while I figured out my next steps. I called Isabella from my brother's house and told her that I was filing for divorce and that she needed to find somewhere else to stay while we worked out the legal arrangements. Isabella was shocked that I was taking such immediate action. She said that I was overreacting and that we should go to counseling to work through our problems. She kept insisting that her relationship with Connor was spiritual, not romantic, and that I was destroying our family over a misunderstanding. But I was done listening to her lies and manipulations. I'd given her a chance to choose our marriage over Connor, and she'd made it clear that she wasn't willing to give up her spiritual teacher to save our relationship. Over the next few days, Isabella called me constantly, alternating between begging me to come home and accusing me of being controlling and spiritually closed-minded. She said that Connor had advised her that my reaction was typical of someone who was threatened by his partner's spiritual growth, and that many marriages went through this kind of crisis when one person evolved faster than the other. Hearing her quote Connor's advice about our marriage just reinforced my decision to end things. This woman was so under another man's influence that she was letting him coach her on how to handle her own husband. I retained the divorce attorney I'd consulted earlier, and we began the process of filing for divorce and requesting temporary custody of the children. My lawyer used Patricia's surveillance report as evidence of Isabella's adultery and her misuse of marital funds to maintain the secret apartment. Isabella initially tried to fight the divorce, claiming that I was being unreasonable and that her relationship with Connor wasn't grounds for ending our marriage. But when her own attorney saw the evidence we gathered, he advised her that she was in a very weak position and should consider agreeing to a settlement rather than going to court. During the divorce proceedings, I learned even more disturbing details about Isabella's relationship with Connor. It turned out that Connor Murphy wasn't actually a spiritual teacher at all. He was a freelance photographer who'd been using the spiritual guru persona to seduce married women. He'd convinced at least 3 other women to leave their husbands for him over the past 5 years. And in each case, he'd used the same story about spiritual healing and tantric energy work. Patricia was able to uncover this information by researching Connor's background and talking to some of his previous victims. Apparently, Connor had a very specific pattern. He'd target married women who were interested in spirituality and personal growth, present himself as an enlightened teacher, and gradually convince them that their marriages were holding back their spiritual development. He'd encourage these women to rent secret apartments where he could conduct his healing sessions, and he'd slowly isolate them from their families and friends by convincing them that only he truly understood their spiritual needs. Several of the women had ended up leaving their husbands and children for Connor, only to be abandoned by him once he found a new target. When I shared this information with Isabella, she initially refused to believe it. She said that Connor had warned her that people might try to turn her against him by spreading lies about his past, and that this was just another test of her commitment to her spiritual growth. But eventually, Isabella started to realize that she'd been manipulated and deceived. Connor had apparently grown tired of her and had started canceling their sessions and being less available. When Isabella confronted him about pulling away, he told her that she'd become too dependent on him and that she needed to learn to find her spiritual strength independently. Isabella finally understood that she'd been used, but by then it was too late to save our marriage. The trust between us had been completely destroyed, and I couldn't get past the months of elaborate lies and manipulation. Update 4. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I was awarded primary custody of the children, largely due to Isabella's admitted adultery and the evidence of her deceptive behavior. Isabella was granted supervised visitation rights until she could demonstrate that she was in a stable living situation and had addressed the issues that led to the breakdown of our marriage. Isabella moved out of our house and eventually found a small apartment across town. She lost most of her freelance design clients when word got around about her behavior, partly because Connor had apparently been using her professional connections to find new targets for his. Do you want to know more about what happened to Connor or Isabella's continued journey?